James Calder had everything: wealth, success, and control over his life, until a chance encounter at a charity gala revealed the son he never knew he had. As secrets unravel, his perfect empire is challenged by the one thing he never anticipated: family. Can love rebuild what ambition broke? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. James Calder stood at the window of his penthouse office, looking down at the busy New York streets below. At 42, he had everything money could buy: expensive suits, luxury cars, and a tech company worth billions. But tonight, something felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that his perfect world was about to change. "Mr. Calder, don't forget about the charity event tonight," his assistant Sarah reminded him from the doorway. "The Children's Hope Foundation is expecting you at 7. James nodded, checking his Rolex. He hated these events, all the small talk and fake smiles. But as CEO of Calder Technologies, he had an image to maintain. "Have the car ready in 20 minutes, he said, not turning around. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was packed with New York's elite when James arrived. Everyone wanted to talk to him, to pitch their ideas, or simply be seen with the famous James Calder. He moved through, the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands and making polite conversation. That's when he saw the boy. The child couldn't have been more than 6 years old, playing with a toy rocket near the dessert table. James froze. It was like looking at one of his own childhood photos. The same dark hair, the same determined expression, even the way the boy's eyebrows furrowed in concentration. "Noah, honey, careful with that rocket," a woman's voice called out. James's heart stopped. He knew that voice. When he turned, there she was, Sophie Hart. 6 years hadn't changed her much. Her blonde hair was shorter now, but she still had those striking green eyes that had caught his attention that night at the tech conference in San Francisco. Sophie saw him at the same moment. The color drained from her face. "James," she whispered, instinctively moving toward the boy. Noah. James did the math in his head. 6 years. The conference. One night that he'd tried to forget because it had meant too much, felt too real. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and controlled despite the storm brewing inside him. Sophie glanced around nervously. "This isn't the place?" "Now, Sophie." His tone left no room for argument. They found a quiet corner of the hotel's garden terrace. The sounds of the party faded behind them as James turned to face her. "Is he mine?" The words came out harder than he intended. Sophie lifted her chin. "Yes." "Were you ever going to tell me?" "No." She didn't hesitate. "You made it very clear. That night that you didn't do relationships or complications, a child would have been the biggest complication of all." James ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up. "That wasn't your decision to make. I had a right to know. I had a son." "Did you?" Sophie's voice rose slightly. "The great James Calder, who works 18-hour days and appears on the cover of Business Weekly. The man who told me that emotional attachments were for people who couldn't handle success. What would you have done if I'd told you?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. What would he have done? 6 years ago, he probably would have thrown money at the situation, hired lawyers, made it go away. But now, looking at Noah through the glass doors, this bright, curious boy who was undeniably his son, something cracked in James's carefully constructed world. "I want to know him," he said finally. Sophie shook her head. "It's not that simple. Noah has a life, a routine. He's happy. I won't let you sweep in and disrupt everything just because you suddenly feel entitled to play daddy. I'm his father. Biology isn't everything, James. Being a father means showing up, being there, putting someone else first. Can you honestly say you're ready for that?" Before he could answer, Noah appeared at the glass doors, his toy rocket clutched in his hands. "Mom, can I have another cookie?" Sophie's whole demeanor changed as she smiled at her son. "Just one." "More, sweetie. Then we need to head home." James watched the boy, his son, bounce back inside. "I want to try," he said quietly. "Give me a chance to prove I can be there for him." Sophie studied him for a long moment. "One wrong move, one missed visit, one time you make him feel less important than your company, and we're done." "Understood." James nodded, his throat tight. "We'll start slow," Sophie continued. "Supervised visits, and we tell Noah when I think the time is right, not before." As they walked back into the ballroom, James couldn't take his eyes off Noah. The boy was now sitting at a table, making his rocket fly above his plate of cookies, completely unaware that his life, all their lives, had just changed forever. The night wound down, and James watched from across the room as Sophie helped Noah into his coat. Just before they left, Noah looked up and caught James's eye. The boy smiled, that same confident, curious smile James saw in his mirror every morning. In that moment, James Calder, the man who had built an empire by never letting anything stand, in his way, realized that his greatest challenge and perhaps his greatest reward was just beginning. He pulled out his phone and called his assistant. "Sarah, clear my schedule for tomorrow afternoon and find out everything you can about the Children's Hope Foundation. I think it's time Calder Technologies got more involved in their work." As he watched Sophie and Noah disappear into the night, James felt something he hadn't experienced in years: fear. Fear of failing, fear of not being good enough, fear of loving someone more than success. But for the first time in his life, he was ready to face that fear head-on. The next chapter of his life was about to begin, and nothing in his Harvard MBA or years of corporate takeovers had prepared him for this. He had a son. Now he just had to figure out how to be a father. A week after the charity event, James sat in his car outside Sophie's modest apartment building in Brooklyn. The neighborhood was a far cry from his Manhattan penthouse, with its small coffee shops and family-owned stores. He checked his reflection in the rearview mirror one last time, noticing he looked more nervous than he had during his last board meeting. His phone buzzed. It was Linda Carson, his company's VP of marketing. "James, we need you for the Johnson merger call." "Not now, Linda. I told you I'm unavailable this afternoon." "But the shareholders—" "Handle it," he said firmly, and hung up. Taking a deep breath, James grabbed the gift-wrapped package from the passenger seat and headed inside. Sophie had agreed to let him visit Noah today, though she'd made it clear this wasn't going to be the day they told Noah who he really was. Sophie opened the door wearing jeans and a simple sweater, so different from the businesswomen James usually dealt with. "You're early," she said. Traffic was light. He held up the package. "I brought something for Noah." Sophie's eyes narrowed. "We need to set some ground rules about gifts, James. I don't want you trying to buy his affection. It's just a model rocket kit. I noticed he likes space." Before Sophie could respond, Noah came running into the living room. "Mom, can I watch TV?" "Oh." He stopped when he saw James. "You're the man from the party, the one who talked to Mom." James's throat felt tight. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. "Hi, Noah. I'm James. I work with your mom's foundation. Do you like rockets too?" Noah pointed to the package in James's hands. "I used to build them when I was your age." James glanced at Sophie, who gave a slight nod. "Would you like to build this one together?" Noah's face lit up. "Mom, can we?" Sophie smiled, but James could see the worry in her eyes. "Sure, honey. But first, homework." "Already done." Noah proudly held up his math worksheet. They spent the next hour on the floor of the living room, carefully assembling the rocket. James was amazed at how quickly Noah picked up the instructions, asking smart questions about how the pieces fit together. "You're good at this," James said, watching Noah concentrate on attaching the fins. "Mom says I'm good at fixing things. Like when her coffee maker broke, I figured out it was just a loose wire." James caught Sophie's eye across the room. She was watching them while pretending to read a book, her expression a mix of worry and something softer. "Speaking of fixing things," Noah continued, "could you help me with my science project? We have to build a simple machine, and Mom's not very good at that stuff." "Noah," Sophie protested, but she was smiling. "I'd love to," James said quickly. "If it's okay with your mum." Sophie hesitated. "We'll see." The afternoon passed too quickly. When it was time for James to leave, Noah insisted on showing him his room. Space posters covered the walls, and a small telescope stood by the window. "That's for stargazing," Noah explained. "But Mom says we can't see many stars in the city." "I know a place upstate where you can see thousands of them," James said without thinking. "Maybe someday." "James?" Sophie's warning tone stopped him. "Right. Well, thank you for letting me visit, Noah. I had fun building the rocket." "Will you come back?" Noah asked. James looked at Sophie. "That's up to your mom." Later, as Sophie walked him to the door, James couldn't help himself. "He's amazing, Sophie. So smart, so curious." "He is," she agreed, "which is why we need to be careful. He gets attached easily, and I won't let him get hurt. I'm not going anywhere." "That's what you say now. But what happens when work calls, when you have a crisis to handle or a deal to close?" As if on cue, James's phone buzzed again. Linda's name flashed on the screen. Sophie raised an eyebrow. "You should get that. Wouldn't want to keep the shareholders waiting." James silenced the phone. They can wait. This is more important. Prove it, Sophie challenged. Not just today, but every day. Show up. Be consistent. That's what being a father means. Back in his car, James stared at his phone. 15 missed. Calls, 37 text messages. The Johnson merger was probably falling apart. 6 months ago, he would have rushed back to the office without a second thought. But now all he could think about was Noah's smile as they built the rocket together. The way the boy's eyes lit up when he talked about stars. The familiar determination in his face as he worked out a problem. James made a decision. He called. Linda. The merger can wait until tomorrow, he told her. And Linda, clear my schedule every Wednesday afternoon from now on. No exceptions. But sir, Wednesday is board meeting day. Then move the board meeting. This is non-negotiable. That night, lying in his expensive bed in his perfect penthouse, James couldn't sleep. His mind kept going back to Sophie's small apartment, with its mismatched furniture and walls covered in Noah's artwork. It felt more like a home than his place ever had. His phone lit up with an incoming message. It was from Sophie, with a photo attached. Noah, fast asleep, clutching the rocket they'd built together. The message read, "He insisted on keeping it next to his bed. Same thing you used to do, isn't it?" James stared at the message for a long time. How did she know that? Had he mentioned it that night in San Francisco? He couldn't remember, but the fact that she did, that she'd noticed and remembered such a detail about him, made something shift in his chest. He typed back, "Thank you for today, for giving me a chance." Sophie's reply came quickly, "Don't make me regret it." James looked out his window at the city lights, thinking about the stars Noah couldn't see. He made another promise to himself, right then. Somehow he would find a way to be the father Noah deserved, even if it meant rebuilding his entire world from the ground up. The rocket was just the beginning. Now he had to prove he could be there for the long haul, one Wednesday, afternoon at a time. 3 weeks of Wednesday afternoons had passed, and James's secretary wasn't the only one noticing the change in his schedule. Victoria Reynolds, the company's chief financial officer and James's longtime friend, cornered him in his office early Monday morning. "The board is talking, James," Victoria said, closing his office door. "Moving the weekly board meeting without explanation? Taking mysterious afternoons off? This isn't like you." James looked up from his computer. "The company's doing fine." "That's not the point. Richard Blake is stirring up trouble. He's suggesting you're losing focus, that maybe it's time for new leadership." "Richard's been after my job for years," James said, but something cold settled in his stomach. Richard Blake was not only a board member, but also his late father's best friend. His opinion carried weight. Victoria perched on the edge of his desk. "What's really going on, James? You can tell me." Before he could answer, his phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. "Noah got an A+ on his science project. He can't wait to show you tomorrow." A smile crossed James's face before he could hide it. Victoria's eyes widened. "There's a woman, isn't there? It's complicated." "It always is with you." Victoria stood up. "Just be careful. Richard's looking for any excuse to call an emergency board meeting." After she left, James stared at the photo on his phone. Noah proudly holding up his science project, a simple pulley system they'd worked on together last Wednesday. The board's opinion had never mattered less. The next afternoon, James walked into Sophie's apartment building and found an unexpected scene. Noah was crying and Sophie looked upset. "What happened?" James asked, his heart racing. "Tommy Sanders pushed me at recess," Noah said between sobs. "He said I was lying about having a dad who builds rockets." James froze. Sophie's face went pale. "Noah, honey," she said quickly, "James is just a friend who—" "But Billy saw him picking me up from science club last week," Noah interrupted. "He said only dads do that stuff." James knelt down to Noah's level, looking helplessly at Sophie. They hadn't planned for this moment. It was too soon. Sophie took a deep breath and sat down on the couch. "Noah, come here, sweetie. There's something we need to talk about." James's heart pounded as Noah climbed onto the couch between them. This was the moment that would change everything. "You know how some families are different," Sophie began, gently. "Some kids live with just their mom, some with their dad, some with both. Like Jenny. She has 2 houses because her parents got divorced." "Right. Well, you and I have been our own little family for a long time, but—" Sophie looked at James, tears in her eyes. "James is your father." Noah looked between them, his small face scrunched in concentration. "Really?" James nodded, his throat tight. "Really? And I'm sorry I wasn't here before, but I want to be here now, if that's okay with you." Noah was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "Is that why we look alike? Billy says we have the same eyes." "Yes," James said softly. "That's why." "Can I call you Dad?" The simple question hit James like a tidal wave. He looked at Sophie, who gave a small nod. "I'd like that very much." Noah threw his arms around James's neck, over the boy's shoulder. James saw Sophie wiping away tears. The moment was interrupted by James's phone ringing. Richard Blake's name flashed on the screen. "Don't answer it," Sophie said quietly. James turned off the phone. They spent the rest of the afternoon answering Noah's questions. Why hadn't James been around before? Would he live with them now? Could they go see the stars he talked about? One thing at a time, Sophie kept saying, but James could see she was overwhelmed too. That evening, after Noah had gone to bed, Sophie walked James to the door. "This changes everything," she said. "I know. He's going to expect you to be there now, really be there." "I will be." Sophie crossed her arms. "Your phone rang 6 times while we were talking to him. It's not important, but it is. That's your life, James. Board meetings and business deals. Are you really ready to put that second?" Before James could answer, his phone lit up with a text from Victoria. "Emergency board meeting called for tomorrow morning. Richard has the votes. You need to get back here now." Sophie saw the message. "Go," she said. "Go deal with your real life." "This is my real life," James insisted. "Noah is my real life now. Prove it." Sophie's voice was tired. "Because tomorrow morning you're going to have to choose, and whatever you decide will affect Noah for the rest of his life." James walked to his car, his mind racing. Richard Blake could take his company, the company his father had started, the one James had built into an empire. Everything he'd worked for was at risk. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a photo from Sophie, Noah sleeping with a framed picture of James on his bedside table. The message read, "He already loves you. Don't make me regret telling him." James started his car, finally knowing what he had to do. Tomorrow morning would change everything, but not in the way Richard Blake expected. For the first time in his life, James Calder was ready to risk his empire for something more important. He just hoped he wasn't too late. The Calder Technologies boardroom was packed the next morning. James could feel the tension as he walked in, his father's portrait staring down at him from the wall. Richard Blake sat at the far end of the table, a slight smile on his face. "James," Richard said, standing up, "so glad you could join us. We were beginning to wonder if you'd show up at all." "Cut the act, Richard." James remained standing. "We both know why you called this meeting." Victoria caught his eye from her seat, silently warning him to stay calm. The other board members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. "Very well," Richard said. "As senior board member and your father's oldest friend, I feel obligated to address the concerns about your recent behavior." He pulled out a folder. "Missed meetings, cancelled appointments, mysterious disappearances every Wednesday afternoon. My personal time is not the board's concern. It is when it affects the company." Richard looked around the table. "The Johnson merger is stalling, the Singapore deal is in limbo, and now I hear rumors about you spending time in Brooklyn of all places." James felt his phone vibrate. A text from Sophie. "Noah wanted to wish you good luck. Whatever happens, we're proud of you." Attached was a photo of Noah giving a thumbs up. Something settled in James's chest. He knew exactly what he needed to do. "You're right, Richard. I have been distracted lately." James walked to the front of the room. "I've been distracted by something far more important than quarterly reports or merger deals." He pulled up a photo on the boardroom's main screen. Noah at the science fair, beaming with pride. "This is my son." The room erupted in whispers. Victoria's mouth fell open. 6 years ago, I made a choice to focus only on business. I missed the first 6 years of my son's life because I thought this company was all that mattered." James looked directly at Richard. "I won't miss another day." "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Richard said. "You're letting emotions cloud your judgment. Your father would be disappointed." "My father?" James laughed. "My father missed every birthday, every school play, every moment that mattered. I swore I'd make him proud by being successful. But you know what? I'm done measuring success by stock prices." He turned to address the entire board. "I'm not stepping down, but I am making changes. Starting today, I'm restructuring the company's leadership. Victoria will take over as Chief Operations Officer, handling day-to-day operations." Victoria sat up straighter, surprised. "I'll remain CEO, focusing on strategy and major decisions. But I will not sacrifice my family for this company. Not anymore. Richard's face turned red. You can't do this. We have the votes. No, you don't. James smiled. While you were plotting this meeting, I was making calls. The Johnson family. They're backing me. Want to know why? Because when I told them I was reorganizing the company to spend more time with my son, Old Man Johnson said it was the smartest decision I've ever made. He pulled up another slide, a chart showing the company's stock performance. Our numbers haven't dropped. If anything, they're stronger. Turns out having a CEO who understands work-life balance is good for business. James walked around the table, looking each board member in the eye. My father built this company by sacrificing everything else. I built it into an empire the same. Wait, but what's the point of an empire if you're alone? His phone buzzed again. Sophie. Noah's school just called. He got into a fight defending you. We need you. James took a deep breath. This meeting is adjourned. Victoria, you'll have the restructuring paperwork by tomorrow. Richard, you can either work with us or resign, your choice. You'll regret this, Richard threatened. No, James said quietly. For the first time in my life, I'm doing something. I won't regret. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door. Where are you going? Richard called after him. We're not finished. Yes, we are. My son needs me. The drive to Noah's school was the longest 20 minutes of James's life. He found Sophie pacing outside the principal's office. What happened? He asked. Tommy, Sanders was saying mean things about you, that you were only pretending to be Noah's dad because you felt sorry for him. Sophie's eyes were red. Noah punched him. James felt a mix of pride and worry. Is he okay? He's suspended for 2 days, but James... Sophie touched his arm. He kept saying he needed his dad. The principal's office door opened, and Noah came out, looking small and scared. When he saw James, his face crumpled. I'm sorry, Noah whispered. I didn't mean to get in trouble. James knelt down and pulled him into a hug. I'm here, buddy. I'm right here. Over Noah's shoulder, he saw Sophie watching them, tears in her eyes. You left your meeting, she said softly. Some things are more important than meetings. That evening they sat on Sophie's couch, Noah sleeping between them after an emotionally exhausting day. James had ordered pizza, and they'd spent hours, talking about everything and nothing. What happens now? Sophie asked. Now? James looked at their sleeping son. Now, I keep my promise. I'm here for him. For both of you, if you'll let me. And the company will survive. I've got good people there. He reached for her hand. I spent so many years trying to make my father proud, but today, looking at Noah, I realized something. What's that? I want my son to be proud of me, not because I'm rich or successful, but because I was there when he needed me. Sophie squeezed his hand. He already is proud of you, so am I. Outside, the city lights twinkled like stars. James remembered Noah's telescope, his dream of seeing real stars. What are you thinking? Sophie asked. I'm thinking it's time for a change. A big one. He turned to her. How do you feel about houses with backyards, somewhere away from the city lights where you can see the stars? Sophie's eyes widened. James, I'm not saying move in together, just closer. Where? Noah can have space to build rockets and look at stars. Where we can figure out what this is between us, without the whole world watching. What about your board, the company? They'll adapt. I already have. He smiled. Besides, I hear the schools are better in Connecticut. Noah stirred between them, mumbling something about rockets in his sleep. James and Sophie shared a look, one full of possibility, fear, and hope. The empire James had built was changing, transforming into something he'd never expected. But, sitting there with his son sleeping peacefully, and Sophie's hand in his, he knew he was finally building something that truly mattered. 2 months had passed since the boardroom showdown. The late summer sun shone down on a beautiful colonial house in Greenwich, Connecticut, as James watched the moving trucks pull up to the curb. He'd found the perfect place, a 4-bedroom home with a huge backyard, just 30 minutes from his Manhattan office. The telescope will go perfectly here, he said, showing Noah the second-floor balcony that faced away from the city lights. We can stargaze whenever you want. Noah bounced with excitement. Can we do it tonight? Let's get moved in first, honey, Sophie called from downstairs, where she was directing movers with boxes from their Brooklyn apartment. They decided to do this properly. Sophie and Noah would have their own space in the main house, while James would stay in the guest house until they figured things out. It wasn't conventional, but nothing about their situation was. Mr. Calder? One of the movers approached with a concerned look. "There's a man at the gate insisting on speaking. With you. Says his name is Richard Blake." James's jaw tightened. "Noah, why don't you help your mum with the boxes?" At the front gate, Richard stood leaning against his luxury car, looking out of place in the suburban setting. "Quite a change from your penthouse," Richard said, eyeing the property. "Does playing happy families make you feel better about betraying your father's legacy?" "What do you want, Richard?" "To warn you, the Singapore deal is falling apart without your full attention. The board is getting nervous. Victoria is handling it." "Victoria isn't a Calder." Richard stepped closer. "Your father built this company for his family, for his son, not for some woman who's clearly after your money." James's fists clenched. "Don't you dare talk about Sophie that way. Wake up, James. She hid your son from you for 6 years. Now suddenly she's willing to play house in a multi-million-dollar property. How convenient. Leave. Now. The press would love this story," Richard continued. "Billionaire CEO James Calder, manipulated by a former one-night stand, and her convenient son. Have you even done a paternity test?" The sound of a door slamming made them both turn. Sophie stood there, her face white with anger. "How dare you?" she said, walking toward them. "You think I want his money? I raised my son alone for 6 years because I thought James deserved better than being trapped by obligation. I was wrong about that, but I was trying to protect both of them." "Sophie, you don't have to explain," James started. "Yes, I do." She faced Richard. "You want a paternity test? Fine, do it. You want to dig into my life? Go ahead. But know this, I make my own money. I have since day one, and this house I'm paying my share of the rent." Richard looked taken aback. "Rent? Yes, rent," James said, "because Sophie refused to let me buy it outright. We're leasing with an option to buy, splitting all costs evenly. Not that it's any of your business." "Dad?" Noah's voice came from the front door. "Is everything okay?" Richard's eyes widened at the sight of the boy, the undeniable mirror image of James at that age. "Everything's fine, buddy," James called. "Back." "Mr. Blake was just leaving." Richard straightened his tie, trying to regain his composure. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is." James's voice was cold. "You can either accept the changes I've made, or you can tender your resignation. Either way, you'll never threaten my family again." After Richard's car disappeared down the tree-lined street, Sophie let out a shaky breath. "He's right about one thing," she said quietly. "This could hurt you. The press, the shareholders. Let them talk." James took her hand. "I've spent my whole life worried about what other people think. Not anymore." Inside, they found Noah in what would be his new bedroom, carefully arranging his spacebooks on a shelf. "Hey, buddy," James said. "How about we take a break from unpacking and get some ice cream? There's a great place in town." Noah's face lit up. "Can we eat it in the backyard?" "Why not? We should start breaking in our new star-watching spot." As they walked to the ice cream shop, Noah between them holding both their hands, several neighbors waved hello. It felt surreal to James, so different from the impersonal nods of his Manhattan doorman. "The Richardsons invited us to their barbecue next weekend," Sophie mentioned. "Apparently Noah and their son Jack are in the same grade." "A barbecue?" James couldn't remember the last time he'd been to one. "Welcome to suburban life," Sophie teased. "Better brush up on your grilling skills." Later that evening, as the sun set, they sat in the backyard. Noah was busy setting up his telescope, while Sophie and James watched from the patio chairs. "I got a job offer," Sophie said suddenly. "Editor position at the Greenwich Daily Post." James turned to her, surprised. "You're leaving the foundation?" "The foundation has great leadership now, and I miss journalism." She looked nervous. "It's less money than I make now, but..." "Take it," James said. "If it's what you want, take it." "Really? Sophie, I never wanted you to give up your dreams. I just want to be part of them." She smiled, reaching for his hand. "You are. All of this. It's more than I ever dreamed." "Mum! Dad!" Noah called excitedly. "I can see Jupiter!" They joined him at the telescope, taking turns looking at the bright planet. James watched as Sophie helped Noah adjust the focus, both of them talking enthusiastically about space. His phone buzzed, Victoria calling about the Singapore deal. For the first time in his life, James hit ignore without a second thought. Some things were more important than business deals, like teaching his son about the stars and falling a little more in love with Sophie every day. Sure, Richard might cause trouble, the press might talk, the board might worry, but standing in his new backyard, Watching the people he loved most in the world explore the night sky together, James knew he'd finally found what real success felt like. "Dad, make a wish." Noah pointed to a shooting star. James looked at his son, then at Sophie. "Don't need to, buddy. I've got everything I could wish for right here." Sophie caught his eye, and in that moment they both knew this unconventional family of theirs might not be perfect, but it was exactly what they all needed. The stars twinkled above them, witnesses to a new beginning. In the distance, Manhattan's lights glowed like a reminder of the life James was slowly leaving behind. But here, in this backyard with the people he loved, he was building something better. One star, one smile, one moment at a time. The autumn leaves were turning golden in Greenwich when the first signs of trouble appeared. James was helping Noah with his homework in the kitchen when Sophie burst through the door, her face pale. "Have you seen this?" She tossed a copy of the Business Weekly onto the counter. The headline read, "Calder Heir, Love Child Scandal Rocks. Tech Empire." James quickly covered Noah's eyes. "Buddy, why don't you go finish your homework upstairs?" Once Noah was out of earshot, James picked up the magazine. Richard Blake's name was quoted throughout the article, suggesting that Sophie had orchestrated the whole thing to gain control of Calder Technologies. "He's trying to destroy us," Sophie whispered, sinking into a chair. James's phone started ringing, Victoria calling. "The stock is dropping," she said when he answered. "The Singapore deal is officially dead. James, we need you back in the office full-time." "I can't just... The board is calling for an emergency meeting tomorrow morning." Sophie watched his face, already knowing. "Go," she said softly. "We'll be fine." But they weren't fine. Over the next few weeks, everything started unraveling. James was stuck in marathon board meetings, trying to save his company. Sophie's new job at the Greenwich Daily Post became awkward when her own journalists started asking questions about the scandal. Worst of all was what happened at Noah's school. "He's being bullied," Sophie told James one night after Noah had gone to bed. "The other kids saw the articles online. They're saying horrible things." James ran his hands through his hair, exhausted. "I'll talk to the principal. When? You're barely here anymore." Sophie's voice cracked. "I know you're trying to save your company, but our son needs you too." "Our son?" James looked up. "So now he's our son? Because when Richard suggested a paternity test, you actually believe those lies?" Sophie stepped back, hurt filling her eyes. "After everything?" "No, James reached for her, but she moved away. "I'm just tired. The board meetings, the press, I get it, this is hard, but pushing us away isn't the solution." "I'm not pushing." A small voice interrupted them. "Are you fighting because of me?" They turned to find Noah in his pajamas, tears in his eyes. "Oh, sweetie, no." Sophie rushed to him. "The kids at school say you're not really my dad." Noah looked at James. "They say Mom only wants your money." James felt like he'd been punched in the gut. He knelt in front of his son. "Noah, listen to me. You are my son. I love you more than anything in this world. Then why are you never here anymore?" The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. James looked at Sophie, saw the same pain reflected in her eyes. "Because I'm an idiot," he said finally. "But that's going to change right now." He pulled out his phone and dialed Victoria. "Cancel tomorrow's board meeting," he said, "and call a press conference for Monday morning." "James, you can't." "Yes, I can. It's time to end this." After hanging up, he turned to his family. "Noah, how about we play hooky tomorrow, all three of us?" Sophie raised an eyebrow. "What do you have in mind?" The next morning, they drove to the Hayden Planetarium in New York. Noah's eyes were wide as they watched the stars swirl above them in the dome. "This is so cool," he whispered. James squeezed Sophie's hand in the dark. "I'm sorry," he said softly, "for letting Richard get in my head, for not being here." "I know," she whispered back. "But James, if we're going to make this work, we need to be a team. No more letting outside forces tear us apart." After the planetarium, they had hot dogs in Central Park. Noah was telling them about a new space book he wanted when James noticed the paparazzi. "Don't look," he told Sophie, "but we've got company." She tensed. "Should we leave?" "No." James stood up. "Actually, this is perfect." He walked straight to the photographers. "You want a story? Be at Calder Technologies on Monday morning. You'll get one hell of a headline." The weekend passed too quickly. Sunday night, as they sat in the backyard looking at stars through Noah's telescope, Sophie finally asked the question, "What are you going to do tomorrow?" What I should have done weeks ago, to maintain separate spaces. But lately the lines had been blurring. Noah moved freely between both houses, and they spent most evenings together anyway. That night, after Noah went to bed, Sophie and James sat on the main house's porch swing, sharing a bottle of wine. "Remember that first day at the charity event?" Sophie asked. "When you saw Noah, how could I forget? I was terrified. And now? Now I can't imagine life without either of you." James took her hand, which is why a car door slammed in the driveway, interrupting the moment. To their shock, James's mother, Eleanor Calder, stepped out of a taxi. "Mom!" James stood up. "What are you doing here?" Eleanor hadn't spoken to him since the press conference scandal. She'd been traveling in Europe, avoiding the whole situation. Can't a mother visit her son? She looked around the suburban setting. And meet her grandson. Sophie squeezed James's hand. "Noah's asleep, but we'd love to have you for breakfast tomorrow." Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. "You must be Sophie, the journalist." "Mom," James warned, "be nice." "I'm always nice, dear." Eleanor swept past them into the house. "Oh, how cozy. Different from your penthouse." James and Sophie shared a look. This was not how they'd planned their evening. The next morning, Noah was ecstatic to meet his grandmother. To everyone's surprise, Eleanor was wonderful with him. She listened to all his space facts, genuinely impressed by his knowledge. "He's just like you were at that age," she told James. "Always curious, always asking questions." Over breakfast, Eleanor watched Sophie and James move around each other in the kitchen, saw how Noah's eyes lit up when he talked to them both. "You know," Eleanor said suddenly, "I was wrong about all this." James nearly dropped the coffee pot. "What?" "I thought you were having some sort of midlife crisis. Abandoning the company, moving to the suburbs." She smiled at Noah, who was showing her his latest space drawing. "But you're happy, really happy. I haven't seen that since you were a child." Sophie sat down next to Eleanor. "We're trying to do things right. Take it slow, make sure Noah's okay with everything." "Slow?" Eleanor laughed. "Darling, I've seen the way my son looks at you, and this whole separate houses arrangement. It's silly." "Mom," James protested. "What? I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." Eleanor pulled something from her purse, an old photo album. "Noah, want to see pictures of your daddy when he was your age?" While Noah and Eleanor pored over the photos, James pulled Sophie into the kitchen. "I'm sorry about my mother," he started. "Don't be," Sophie smiled. "She's right, you know. About the separate houses. It's silly." She stepped closer. "Maybe it's time we talked about changing that." James's hand went to the ring box in his pocket. This wasn't how he'd planned it, but maybe perfect moments didn't need perfect planning. "Sophie," he began. "Dad," Noah called from the living room. "Is this really you in the rocket costume?" The moment broke, but Sophie's eyes told him they'd finish this conversation later. That evening, after Eleanor had gone to her hotel and Noah was in bed, they sat in the backyard despite the cold. "Your mum gave me something," Sophie said quietly. She pulled out an old photograph, James as a baby, wearing a tiny silver bracelet. "She said it was your first piece of jewelry, that she kept it all these years, hoping what? That you'd find someone to give it to, for your own child." Sophie's voice wavered. "She wants Noah to have it." James felt his throat tighten. "Mum never gives away family heirlooms. She said Noah is family, that I'm family." Sophie looked at him. "Are we? Really?" James reached for the ring box, but again the moment was interrupted, this time by Noah's voice from his bedroom window. "Mom, Dad, I can see the meteor shower." They rushed upstairs to Noah's room where he was bouncing excitedly by his telescope. Together, they watched the streaks of light paint the sky. "Make a wish," Noah told them. James looked at Sophie, at their son, at this life they'd built together. He didn't need to wish anymore. He just needed the right moment to ask the question that would make their family complete. Later, alone in the guest house, he held the ring up to the moonlight. Soon, he thought, very soon, outside the winter stars. Him. When he finally looked up, Sophie was curled in a chair, asleep. The morning sun was starting to peek through the windows. His phone buzzed. Victoria again. "Olivia's called a press conference for this afternoon. James, she's going to destroy Sophie's reputation right before the Pulitzer ceremony." James looked at Sophie, peaceful in sleep despite everything. He thought about their months together, about Noah, about the family they'd built. He made a decision. "Tell Olivia I want to meet. 1 hour, my office." The elevator ride to his Manhattan office felt endless. But when the doors opened, there she was, Olivia, looking exactly as he remembered. Beautiful, polished, and completely cold. "James, darling," she purred, "finally ready to admit you made a mistake. The only mistake I made was ever thinking you cared about anything but money." Her smile faltered. "That reporter ruined everything. She took you from me." "No, Olivia, you never had me, and now you never will." He pulled out his phone. "I just sent Victoria proof of your insider trading from 3 years ago. Try to hurt Sophie and it goes public. You wouldn't dare. Your stock would tank." "I don't care about the stock. I care about my family." He stepped closer. "Leave them alone or I'll burn everything down, including your reputation." Back in Greenwich that evening, James found Sophie in the main house kitchen, practicing her Pulitzer acceptance speech. "I'll have to thank Olivia," she said without looking up. "Her attempt to destroy me this afternoon backfired spectacularly. The press loves a redemption story. The journalist who gave up her career rather than publish a hurtful expose, only to find love with the man she was supposed to investigate." James sat beside her. "I'm sorry I doubted you." "Don't be. I should have told you everything from the start." She finally met his eyes. "No more secrets." "No more secrets," he agreed. Then, making a decision, he pulled out the ring box. "Which is why I need to tell you something. I've been carrying this around for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment." Sophie's eyes widened as he opened the box. "I had this whole Christmas proposal planned," he continued, "but I realized something today. The perfect moment isn't about timing or decorations. It's about us. Messy past, complicated present and all." He got down on one knee. "Sophie Hart, I love you. I love our son. I love our life. Will you?" "Yes." Noah's voice came from the doorway. They turned to find him in his pajamas, grinning. "Say yes, Mom." Sophie laughed through her tears. "Get over here, you little spy." Noah ran to them, and James pulled him close as he slipped the ring on Sophie's finger. "I love you both so much," Sophie whispered. Outside, Christmas lights twinkled in the snowy yards of their neighbors. Inside, a family that had found each other against all odds held onto their perfect moment. It hadn't happened the way James planned, but somehow it had happened exactly the way it was supposed to. Spring had arrived in Greenwich, bringing with it cherry blossoms and wedding plans. Sophie stood in their bedroom, no longer divided between two houses, looking at the simple white dress hanging on the closet door. In 2 days, she would become Mrs. Calder, though she'd decided to keep Hart as her professional name. "Mom," Noah called from downstairs. "Grandma Eleanor is here." Sophie smiled. James's mother had become their strongest ally, helping with wedding preparations and doting on Noah. Such a change from her first cold visit months ago. Downstairs, Eleanor was directing florists while Noah showed her his science project, a Chi model of the solar system he was presenting at school next week. "Sophie, darling," Eleanor called, "the flowers for the backyard ceremony are here. I thought simple white roses just like you wanted." The backyard wedding had been James's idea. No press, no society pages, he'd insisted. Just family and close friends. Sophie was about to check the flowers when her phone rang. The caller ID showed her father's number, the father she hadn't spoken to in 10 years. "Dad?" she answered hesitantly. "Sophie." Robert Hart's voice was gruff. "I saw the wedding announcement in the Greenwich paper." "Oh." Sophie's heart sank. She'd sent him an invitation but hadn't heard back. "Yes, I'm getting married. To James Calder." He paused. "The man whose engagement you once investigated." "Dad, that was years ago. Things are different now." "Are they? Or are you just living out the story you always wanted to write?" Sophie felt tears stinging her eyes. "You don't know anything about my life. I know you hid a grandson from his father for 6 years, just like your mother hid you from me after the divorce. That was different. Mom was protecting me from your drinking, your gambling. And now you're marrying a billionaire. How convenient." The line went dead. Sophie stood there, shaking until Eleanor touched her arm. "Bad news?" "My father," Sophie whispered. "He's not coming to the wedding." Eleanor's face softened. "His loss, dear. Now come see these flowers before the heat wilts them." But Sophie couldn't shake her father's words. That evening, after Noah was in bed, she found James in his home office. "Maybe we should postpone," she said. James looked up, alarmed. "What? Why?" "My father called. He thinks I'm just after your money, that I'm living out some reporter's fantasy." She twisted her engagement ring. "Maybe he's right. Maybe I did manipulate everything from the start." James stood and pulled her close. "Stop. Your father doesn't know you, doesn't know us." "But..." "No buts." He led her to the window overlooking their backyard. Workers were setting up the wedding arch where they'd exchange vows. See that spot right there? That's where Noah hit his first baseball last summer. And over there? That's where you fell asleep reading him stories last fall. And right there, under that tree, that's where I fell in love with you all over again, watching you teach our son about constellations. Sophie leaned against him. I just want everything to be perfect. It will be, because we're together. The next morning brought more surprises. Victoria arrived early, looking worried. The board wants to make an announcement at the wedding, she said, about the company's future. James frowned. We said no business. They're worried about succession, about Noah's future role. He's 7, Sophie protested. He doesn't need that pressure. I'll handle it, James assured her, but Sophie could see the worry in his eyes. As if they didn't have enough stress, the weather forecast changed. Rain was now predicted for the outdoor ceremony. We need a backup plan, Eleanor insisted, but Sophie had a different idea. That afternoon, she found Noah in his room, working on his science project. Hey, sweetie, want to help me with something special for the wedding? Noah's eyes lit up. Like a surprise for Dad? Together, they spent hours stringing tiny lights across the backyard, weaving them through trees and around the wedding arch. Even if it rains, Sophie explained, these will shine through the drops like stars. Like our own constellation, Noah said proudly. The day before the wedding, Sophie got another call, this time from her old editor in San Francisco. We're running a story, he said, about your history with the Calders. Olivia Rothschild provided some old photos, suggesting you planned everything from the start. Sophie felt sick. That was years ago. I never published anything negative about them. But you investigated them. The public has a right to know. After hanging up, Sophie sat in the backyard, staring at the wedding arch. All their careful planning, their desire for a private ceremony, it was falling apart. James found her there at sunset. Victoria told me about the story. I'm so sorry, I never wanted... I have an idea, he interrupted, but it's a bit crazy. 2 hours later, they were all in the car. James, Sophie, Noah, and Eleanor driving through the night. James wouldn't say where they were going, just promised it would be worth it. At midnight, they pulled up to the Hayden Planetarium, the same place they'd visited months ago as a family. I made some calls, James explained. They're letting us use it tonight. Inside, the dome was lit with thousands of stars. The wedding arch had been moved there, surrounded by Eleanor's white roses and Noah's twinkling lights. We can get married right now, James said softly. Just us, under the stars our son loves so much. Sophie looked at Noah, who was beaming, at Eleanor, who had tears in her eyes, at James, who had found a way to make everything perfect. Yes, she whispered, right now. As they stood under the arch, Noah holding their rings, the planetarium stars spinning slowly above them, Sophie finally understood. Perfect moments weren't about timing or weather or press stories. They were about family, about love, about choosing each other again and again, no matter what. James squeezed her hand as they began their vows, and Sophie knew this was exactly where they were meant to be, under a ceiling of stars, with their son between them, writing their own story. Tomorrow the press could write whatever they wanted. Tonight belonged to them, to their family, to their love, to their future together. And somewhere in that vast projection of stars above them, Sophie swore she could see their own constellation shining bright and true. 1 year had passed since the midnight wedding at the planetarium. The story had made headlines, but not in the way Olivia had planned. Tech billionaire chooses love over empire became the narrative, especially after photos leaked of the intimate ceremony under the stars. Now, on a warm summer evening, the Calder backyard was once again filled with lights and laughter. This time they were celebrating Noah's 8th birthday. Make a wish, sweetheart, Sophie called as Noah stood before his rocket-shaped cake. The candles flickered in the twilight, casting a warm glow on the faces of their family and friends. James watched his son, remembering that first moment at the charity event when he'd spotted him playing with a toy rocket. Now Noah was winning science fairs and already talking about becoming an astronaut. Dad, Noah called after blowing out his candles, can we show everyone our surprise now? James nodded, and Noah ran to pull a sheet off a large object in the corner of the yard. There stood a professional-grade telescope, bigger than any they'd had before. Your father and I thought it was time for an upgrade, Sophie explained to the amazed guests, especially since she placed a hand on her slightly rounded belly, and their friends burst into applause. The news of baby number 2 had brought them all together for this special celebration. Eleanor wiped tears from her eyes. "Another grandchild to spoil," she said happily. "And this time I'll be here from the start." Victoria, who had proven to be an excellent CEO, raised her glass. To the growing Calder family. As their guests gathered around the telescope, James pulled Sophie aside. "I have another surprise," he whispered, "but this one's just for us." After the party wound down and Noah was asleep upstairs, James led Sophie to his home office. On his desk sat a familiar laptop, the one she'd shown him that night with all her old articles. "I found something interesting," he said, opening a document. "That article you never published about Olivia. The research you did actually uncovered something bigger." Sophie leaned in to look. "The fake charities. Not just that. The money trail you started following. It led somewhere. Somewhere important." He pulled up more documents. "Remember Richard Blake's suspicious dealings? Turns out he and Olivia were working together long before any of this. They were embezzling from children's charities for years." Sophie's journalistic instincts kicked in. "That's why they both came after us. They were afraid I'd connect the dots." "Exactly. Victoria found the proof last week. They're both being indicted." Sophie sat heavily in a chair. "All this time, you were right from the start. You just didn't know how right." James knelt beside her. "The U.S. Attorney's Office wants to talk to you. Your old research could help put them away for good." Tears filled Sophie's eyes. "I always wondered if I'd made the right choice not publishing that article." "You did, because it led us here." He placed a hand on her belly. "To our family." A knock at the door interrupted them. Noah stood there in his pajamas, clutching his astronomy book. "I can't sleep," he said. "Can we look at the new telescope?" Outside, the summer night was perfect for stargazing. As James helped Noah adjust the focus, Sophie thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that first charity event to the planetarium wedding, from separate houses to a true home, from secrets and doubts to complete trust and love. "Look," Noah exclaimed. "I found Saturn. You can see the rings and everything." James pulled Sophie close as they watched their son explore the cosmos. "You know what I was thinking about today?" "What's that?" "That night at the charity event, when I first saw him playing with that rocket." James smiled. "I was so scared of being a father. And now I can't imagine being anything else." He touched her belly gently. "Think this one will love space too? With this family, how could they not?" Noah called them over excitedly. "Mom, Dad, I found a new star. Can we name it?" "Stars already have names, honey," Sophie explained. "But we can make up our own name just for us." Noah looked thoughtful. "How about Hope? Because that's what brought us together, right? The Children's Hope Foundation." James and Sophie shared a look, remembering that fateful charity event. "Hope is perfect," James said softly. Later that night, after Noah had finally gone to bed, James and Sophie sat on their porch swing, looking up at their star. "I found my old diary from that night in San Francisco," Sophie said quietly. "Want to know what I wrote?" "Tell me." "I wrote, 'Met someone tonight, someone who could change everything, but I'm going to walk away because some stories aren't meant to be written.'" She laughed softly. "I was wrong about that part." "Our story was meant to be written," James agreed, "just not the way any of us expected." Inside, their home was filled with signs of their life together. Noah's science projects, Sophie's Pulitzer on the mantle, family photos everywhere. The guest house had been converted into a home office where they both worked, James running. The charitable foundation they'd started together, Sophie writing stories that mattered. "The baby moved," Sophie said suddenly, taking James's hand. As they felt their second child kick, a shooting star streaked across the sky. "Should we make a wish?" James asked. Sophie looked at their home, thought of their sleeping son upstairs, felt the new life moving within her, and squeezed her husband's hand. "No need," she said. "We already have everything we could wish for." Above them, the stars twinkled like they had that night at the planetarium, witnesses to a love story that had defied expectations. A story of second chances and first loves, of fathers and sons, of truth and trust. A story that proved sometimes the happy ending isn't about where you start, but about who you choose to be. About the family you make and the love you fight for. A story written not in newspaper headlines or company ledgers, but in the stars themselves. And somewhere up there, a star named Hope shone brightly over the Calder home, watching over a family that had found each other against all odds, and chosen love over everything else. The end.